President of Strategic Economic Decisions. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the problem of Europe. I'm going to approach it differently, bypassing the issue of the euro and focusing, if you can believe it, on something that's rarely discussed, which is even more important than the euro. The euro itself, you can argue, was a mistake. In fact, there was a justification for the euro, but in its original form, via the Treaty of Rome, the euro was to consist of 6 fairly correlated economies where it made sense to have a common currency. Throwing in Greece at the last minute or whoever, going up to 17 members from 6 was, I think we'll look back on that as a mistake. And now they're dealing with that. I don't really want to talk about that today. I want to talk about how to fix a problem that very much bedevils the euro, but which is a much deeper problem. Long before the euro, one of the former chancellors of Germany invented the term Eurosclerosis, or I think The Economist magazine made it popular. It means the growth rate of Europe was sclerotic. It was below what it should be. The unemployment rate in most European countries was too high, certainly compared to the United States. It's still the case. The slow growth, when the euro crisis and the sovereign debt crisis hit, well, the threesome of problems makes the thing, it's a disaster. Had you had very fast growth, you could have sustained the euro crisis much better. But the slow growth, which is part and parcel of the sovereign debt crisis, then add in the euro crisis, and you've got a spaghetti bolognese of problems. So what I want to do today is focus more on eurosclerosis and how it can be fixed. And the reason I do this is when you get off a plane in Europe today, the big word is austerity. A year ago, Mrs. Merkel in Germany, you may remember, I think it was December 18th in 2011, went along with a request for a bailout money of 560 billion, I forget the exact amount, but said, I want austerity. Come March of that year, the Financial Times, The Economist began to weigh in on the fact that, wait a minute, we all agree you have to trim the welfare state. You can't have policemen getting pensions at 50. But austerity means even slower growth. And Mrs. Merkel, Europe's problem is that it has a debt crisis. The only way out of a debt crisis typically is you outgrow it. Indeed, in my country, in the United States, we had debt of 130% debt to GDP at the end of World War II. We grew fast for the next 30 years, and that 130% debt to GDP ratio, which is terrible, went back to 30%. In beating Napoleon, the British debt was 280% to GDP. I think it went back to zero 80 years later with a great success of Britain as the leader in the Industrial Revolution. So Mrs. Merkel, let's have austerity. Let's have macro austerity 10 years later. We can't slow growth down now. We've got to outgrow this crisis. And this is where we're at. Now the problem here is it's not about Mrs. Merkel, it's about the bond market. Bond market vigilantes. They're not interested. They say you borrowed and spent badly. You racked up huge debts. We are withdrawing the welcome mat to borrowing more. So Italy, we're going to charge you a 400 basis point risk premium because you're a bad bet. Portugal, Greece, whoever. France is probably going to be coming up in the coming year. France is a mess. The bond markets may hit France, and who knows, they'll come to America in 3 or 4 years. I think they will. Here's what I want to do. I want to argue that you indeed can have both the macro austerity that I think we all agree Mrs. Merkel is right. You can have policemen collecting pensions at 50 and also have much more rapid growth. I'm arguing you can have your cake and eat it to Europe. How can I make such a statement? To understand this, we have to go right back to the foundations of macroeconomic theory, remembering that macroeconomics is the branch of economics that deals with how government can regulate business cycles and make things better. Now, when you go take Ec 101, you remember that macroeconomics consisted really of two different topics: fiscal policy, which is deficit management, versus monetary policy, which is interest rates, money supply, inflation, and all of that. What is never pointed out is that on the macroeconomic dashboard, you don't just have fiscal and you don't just have monetary variables. There's a third, very much overlooked and very important lever called regulatory policy. In the case of Europe, regulation has been very bad in almost every country for at least 50 years. Let me make the point more clearly. There are two forms of regulation of markets which in principle slow down economic growth. First, if you have a regulated labor market, can't fire, which means you won't hire. If you have rigidities, it slows growth down because you and I can't do what we otherwise would do. So, labor markets in Europe are really problematic. In the south of Europe, you can't fire. The first rule of the labor market is, quote, if I know I can't fire, I won't hire. Whereas I showed the reverse of this in a memo I did for Clinton and Rubin a number of years ago. I took the United States data, and at the time in 1998, we were firing a lot of people in IT, and yet the unemployment rate kept dropping. It didn't make sense. So I got out the data. I went back 25 years and found that in 25 years, the US had fired some 29 million people in the private sector. Per capita, our firing rate was 4 times anybody else in Europe. We're merciless. But let the other shoe drop. We hired 52 million people. Our net job growth was far the highest. This is nothing more than the old economist Schumpeter's concept of creative destruction. Let the 1,000 typists be fired. You don't know it, but there are going to be 2,200 new jobs in word processing geeks and this and that and the other thing. Don't stand in the way of progress. Don't protect the vested interests. So, in Southern Europe particularly, growth would be much higher. New businesses would form much more rapidly if you didn't have the dead weight loss from labor market rigidities. McKinsey and Company, the consultancy, their global institute, which does terrific work, in the 1990s did a very expensive study of the nature and origins of growth, in particular productivity growth, in a number of different countries, from Japan to the United States, Europe, and they looked at productivity growth in services versus manufacturing, capital versus labor. It was a fabulous study. It reinforced exactly the point I'm saying, that labor and product markets, when you deregulate them, hugely accelerate growth. Now, I was a little bit involved in this. I was asked to help a couple of times, but the conclusion of the study that I found most remarkable is that product market deregulation was every bit as, if not more important, the labor market. Now, I don't think I've ever seen that word in print. Let me give an example. A rich businessman bribes the government, purchases a license, to put it politely, in Portugal to have a licensed monopoly to sell painkillers, Advil, aspirin, whatever, basic stuff. He's a monopolist. The customer will now pay double per tablet than otherwise if you had competition. Secondly, to save on rent. Being a monopolist, he can put himself where he wants. He doesn't rent in the expensive midtown section. He goes to the suburbs. You drive 20 kilometers to go buy your Advil. Third, you got to do it in prime time, because in Portugal you pay a lot higher wages on weekends, so he's not open on weekends. You have to be there by 6 o'clock Friday. Think of the loss to you in wasted time, fuel, parking, and price per tablet of this system versus, say, a US system where you can buy aspirin 24 hours a day in many, many places for a fifth the price. Take that loss of what we call consumer surplus from these impediments, multiply that loss by the number of times you make that trip every year to get your painkiller. Now take that loss and multiply it by N, which is the number of other things that you have to buy or deal with that are regulated. Now take that total cost to you of excess regulation and multiply that cost by the number of people who suffer this in the country. You have a big fat slice of GDP. We're wasting GNP and growing slow because of all these regulations in the product market. So I have no sympathy for the current consensus about Europe, which is we're on the horns of a dilemma. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If you don't listen to the bond market and have austerity, they'll jack up your interest rates, or try to. If you do go along with the bond market, they love you for 3 months until it turns out that the austerity has lowered your growth to such a point that they now downgrade you again. Second option, pay no attention to the bond market. Don't please them. Don't have austerity. They'll penalize you right up front, and that will slow your growth rate down again, and it's a vicious spiral. My approach is, Mrs. Merkel, you can have your cake and eat it too. We do need macro austerity, and we need it now as the welfare states are going broke. But by deregulating product and labor markets, you double the growth rate of Europe and you have your cake and eat it too. So once again, deregulatory policy should be viewed as every bit as important as monetary policy and fiscal policy. And one of the vice premiers of China 5 years ago made the point that this was exactly what made China China. Fiscal and monetary policy aren't behind China's going to become #2 economy in the world. 5 words were spoken that made this happen. It was, I think, in 1980 that Deng Xiaoping famously said, it's okay to go get rich now. That's right, deregulate, start a business, move 500 miles. The Chinese people took off. They created one of the great stories ever. That's not to say there aren't problems in China. There are, and government corruption is a huge problem. But the basic story there, or in the New Ireland, the New Iceland, many, many places, once you deregulate, let people go at it, have opportunities to start businesses, can hire and fire when they want, and don't waste money driving 20 kilometers to buy aspirin, you have a much better growth rate and your problems disappear. I hope this has been helpful in providing a new approach, a new slant, shall we say, on the dilemmas and crises of Europe today. Thank you.